Matthew 5:42. Give to him that asketh of thee. Though the words of Christ, which are related by Matthew, appear to command us to give to all without discrimination, yet we gather a different meaning from Luke, who explains the whole matter more fully. First, it is certain that it was the design of Christ to make his disciples generous, but not prodigals, and it would be a foolish prodigality to scatter at random what the Lord has given us. Again, we see the rule which the Spirit lays down in another passage for liberality. Let us therefore hold, first, that Christ exhorts his disciples to be liberal and generous, and next, that the way of doing it is, not to think that they have discharged their duty when they have aided a few persons, but to study to be kind to all, and not to be weary of giving, so long as they have the means. Besides, that no man may cavil at the words of Matthew, let us compare what is said by Luke. Christ affirms that when, in lending or doing other kind offices, we look to the mutual reward, we perform no part of our duty to God. He thus draws a distinction between charity and carnal friendship. Ungodly men have no disinterested affection for each other, but only a mercenary regard, and thus, as Plato judiciously observes, every man draws on himself that affection which he entertains for others. But Christ demands from his own people disinterested beneficence, and bids them study to aid the poor, from whom nothing can be expected in return. We now see what it is, to have an open hand to petitioners. It is to be generously disposed to all who need poor assistance, and who cannot return the favor. Luke 6:35. Lend, expecting nothing again. It is a mistake to confine this statement to usury, as if Christ only forbade his people to be usurers. The preceding part of the discourse shows clearly that it has a wider reference. After having explained what wicked men are wont to do, to love their friends, to assist those from whom they expect some compensations, to lend to persons like themselves, that they may afterwards receive the like from them, Christ proceeds to show how much more he demands from his people, to love their enemies, to show disinterested kindness, to lend without expecting a return. We now see that the word nothing is improperly explained as referring to usury, or to any interest that is added to the principal, whereas Christ only exhorts us to perform our duties freely, and tells us that mercenary acts are of no account in the sight of God. Not that he absolutely condemns all acts of kindness which are done in the hope of a reward, but he shows that they are of no weight as a testimony of charity, because he alone is truly beneficent to his neighbors, who is led to assist them without any regard to his own advantage, but looks only to the necessities of each. Whether it is ever lawful for Christians to derive profit from lending money, I shall not argue at greater length under this passage, lest I should seem to raise the question unseasonably out of a false meaning which I have now refuted. Christ's meaning, as I have already explained, is simply this: when believers lend, they ought to go beyond heathens, or, in other words, they ought to exercise pure liberality. Matthew 5:43. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. It is astonishing that the scribes fell into so great an absurdity as to limit the word neighbor to benevolent persons, for nothing is more obvious or certain than that God, in speaking of our neighbors, includes the whole human race. Every man is devoted to himself, and whenever a regard to personal convenience occasions an interruption of acts of kindness, there is a departure from that mutual intercourse, which nature itself dictates. To keep up the exercise of brotherly love, God assures us that all men are our brethren, because they are related to us by a common nature. Whenever I see a man, I must, of necessity, behold myself as in a mirror, for he is my bone and my flesh. Genesis 29:14. Now, though the greater part of men break off, in most instances, from this holy society, yet their depravity does not violate the order of nature, for we ought to regard God as the author of the union. Hence we conclude that the precept of the law, by which we are commanded to love our neighbor, is general. But the scribes, judging of neighborhood from the disposition of the individual, affirmed that no man ought to be reckoned a neighbor, unless he were worthy of esteem on account of his own excellencies, or, at least, unless he acted the part of a friend. This is, no doubt, supported by the common opinion, and therefore the children of the world are not ashamed to acknowledge their resentments, when they have any reason to assign for them. But the charity, which God requires in His law, looks not at what a man has deserved, but extends itself to the unworthy, the wicked, and the ungrateful. Now, this is the true meaning which Christ restores, and vindicates from calumny, and hence it is obvious, as I have already said, that Christ does not introduce new laws, but corrects the wicked glosses of the scribes, by whom the purity of the divine law had been corrupted. 44. Love your enemies. This single point includes the whole of the former doctrine, for he who shall bring his mind to love those who hate him, will naturally refrain from all revenge, will patiently endure evils, will be much more prone to assist the wretched. Christ presents to us, in a summary view, the way and manner of fulfilling this precept: "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," Matthew 22:39, for no man will ever come to obey this precept, till he shall have given up self-love, or rather denied himself, until men, all of whom God has declared to be connected with him, shall be held by him in such estimation, that he shall even proceed to love those by whom he is regarded with hatred. We learn from these words, how far believers ought to be removed from every kind of revenge, for they are not only forbidden to ask it from God, but are commanded to banish and efface it from their minds so completely, as to bless their enemies. In the meantime, they do not fail to commit their cause to God, till He take vengeance on the reprobate, for they desire, as far as lies in them, that the wicked should return to a sound mind, that they may not perish, and thus they endeavor to promote their salvation. And there is still this consolation, by which all their distresses are soothed. They entertain no doubt, that God will be the avenger of obstinate wickedness, so as to make it manifest, that those who are unjustly attacked are the objects of His care. It is very difficult, indeed, and altogether contrary to the disposition of the flesh, to render good for evil. But our vices and weakness ought not to be pleaded as an apology. We ought simply to inquire, what is demanded by the law of charity, for, if we rely on the heavenly power of the Spirit, we shall encounter successfully all that is opposed to it in our feelings. This is undoubtedly the reason why monks, and other bawlers of the same class, imagine that these were advices, and not precepts, given by Christ, for they took the strength of men as the standard, for ascertaining what they owed to God and to His law. And yet the monks were not ashamed to claim perfection for themselves, having voluntarily bound themselves to attend to His advices. How faithfully they support the title to which they lay claim I do not now say, but the folly and absurdity of alleging, that they are only advices, will appear from many considerations. First, to say that He advised His disciples, but did not authoritatively command them, to do what was right, is to dishonor Christ. Secondly, to represent the duties of charity, which depend on the law, as matters on which they are left at liberty, is highly foolish. Thirdly, the words ego de lego human, but I say to you, mean in this passage, I denounce, or I command, and cannot, with propriety, be rendered, I advise. Lastly, that it is an express command of what must necessarily be obeyed, is proved, without any difficulty, from the words of Christ, for He immediately adds, 45. That ye may be the children of your Father who is in heaven. When He expressly declares, that no man will be a child of God, unless he loves those who hate him, who shall dare to say, that we are not bound to observe this doctrine? The statement amounts to this: whoever shall wish to be accounted a Christian, let him love his enemies. It is truly horrible and monstrous, that the world should have been covered with such thick darkness, for 3 or 4 centuries, as not to see that it is an express command, and that every one who neglects it is struck out of the number of the children of God. It ought to be observed that, when the example of God is held out for our imitation, this does not imply, that it would be becoming in us to do whatever God does. He frequently punishes the wicked, and drives the wicked out of the world. In this respect, He does not desire us to imitate Him, for the judgment of the world, which is His prerogative, does not belong to us. But it is His will, that we should imitate his fatherly goodness and liberality. This was perceived, not only by heathen philosophers, but by some wicked despisers of godliness, who have made this open confession, that in nothing do men resemble God more than in doing good. In short, Christ assures us, that this will be a mark of our adoption, if we are kind to the unthankful and evil. And yet you are not to understand, that our liberality makes us the children of God, but the same Spirit, who is the witness, Romans 8:16, earnest, Ephesians 1:14, and seal, Ephesians 4:30, of our free adoption, corrects the wicked affections of the flesh, which are opposed to charity. Christ therefore proves from the effect, that none are the children of God, but those who resemble him in gentleness and kindness. Luke says, "And you shall be the children of the highest." Not that any man acquires this honor for himself, or begins to be a child of God, when he loves his enemies, but because, when it is intended to excite us to do what is right, Scripture frequently employs this manner of speaking, and represents as a reward the free gifts of God. The reason is, he looks at the design of our calling, which is, that, in consequence of the likeness of God having been formed anew in us, we may live a devout and holy life. He maketh his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. He quotes two instances of the divine kindness toward us, which are not only well known to us, but common to all, and this very participation excites us the more powerfully to act in a similar manner towards each other, though, by a synecdoche, he includes a vast number of other favors. 46. Do not even the publicans the same? In the same sense, Luke calls them sinners, that is, wicked and unprincipled men. Not that the office is condemned in itself, for the publicans were collectors of taxes, and as princes have a right to impose taxes, so it is lawful to levy them from the people. But they are so called, because men of this class are usually covetous and rapacious, nay, deceitful and cruel, and because among the Jews they were the agents of a wicked tyranny. If anyone shall conclude from the words of Christ, that publicans are the basest of all men, he will argue ill, for our Lord employs the ordinary phraseology. His meaning is, those who are nearly devoid of humanity have some appearance of discharging mutual duties, when they see it to be for their own advantage. 48. You shall therefore be perfect? This perfection does not mean equality, but relates solely to resemblance. However distant we are from the perfection of God, we are said to be perfect, as he is perfect, when we aim at the same object, which he presents to us in himself. Should it be thought preferable, we may state it thus. There is no comparison here made between God and us, but the perfection of God means, first, that free and pure kindness, which is not induced by the expectation of gain, and, secondly, that remarkable goodness, which contends with the malice and ingratitude of men. This appears more clearly from the words of Luke, "Be ye therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful," for mercy is contrasted with a mercenary regard, which is founded on private advantage.